perfect lead-in into our next segment was the a PSA you just heard, right, about how to find CTV News. And now that we're dealing with the impacts of Bill C-18 in this country. And you know what? It's not just Bill C-18, by the way. Liberal government, the federal government, has actually passed a couple of bills in the last year dealing with how you consume media, you consume content on various platforms. Bill C-11 also added to this mix. And I'm really happy to welcome onto the program Ashkan Karbasfrooshan. He's the founder of WatchMojo. And if you don't know it, WatchMojo, one of the most successful, popular channels on YouTube, based right here in Montreal. And I really wanted to pick his brain on what he thought about the impact of these bills really is. Ash, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's I don't where we should start off. I mean, there's a couple of bills here. I think one, Bill C-11, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's the one that can impact your business a little bit more, because doesn't it deal with what the platforms have to show Canadians when they log on to YouTube or Netflix or a streaming service?
That's part of it. I mean, I think at the core, it's wanting to mirror broadcasts CanCon rules to streaming. But when you dig in, it has more to do with the platforms also taking a portion of Canadian revenues and feeding it into the kind of envelopes that then go to fund so-called Canadian content.
And so let me ask you if you think, because I think the government was saying, well, what's happening now isn't fair. Let's try and bring fairness. And they've maybe not succeeded at that. But I'd love to know your take on how the platforms treat content creators. I mean, WatchMojo, big content creator. Have the platforms been fair to you before these bills?
I mean, look, to be fair, no pun intended, it's relative, right? I mean, YouTube is relative to Facebook a great partner, but not because Facebook is inherently evil or anything, just because for Facebook, video is one of 25 different product lines, so to speak. I think the bigger issue, however, is that the web by nature is democratic. It's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. TV was imperfect. Print was imperfect. Neither was radio. Neither was any other medium. But the web is probably the best, purest form of communication that you have, because in theory, we live in a democratic society. Anybody could be a content creator, a storyteller, can have their voices heard. And I don't necessarily think that government should be meddling into dictating to either consumers or these, for-profit, privately held companies, so to speak, or publicly traded that have created a far better way to distribute content. And that's the reality. WatchMojo, and not just WatchMojo, the solopreneur who is running a blog, or the storyteller, content creator, influencer, whoever that doesn't have to work a 9 to 5 that maybe they're not happy with, it's given everybody a pretty even playing field. And I think it's crazy for the government to want to replicate what is an antiquated model in broadcast to the web.
So why do you think they did it? Right there, I always want to try and find out the why here. So there were calls from someone,
sure,
people, groups, or why do you think the government went down this path?
So this is when I might be getting banned from CJAD, which I recognize is owned by Bell. So it's a bit, But look, I'm not actually one of those guys that thinks like Bell is a monopoly or is like a dinosaur or anything like that. I have a lot of execs that I know at Bell, and I think Bell could be affordable, 21st century media company, right? So I don't come in with that bias at all. But I do think you got to be fair, and it's not just Bell, DCE, it's not just Rogers, but generally speaking, if you have incumbents that have had a business model that started off as monopolies, and I'm also talking about the U.S., right? A lot of news organizations, they were monopolies. They owned local content, they owned local classifieds that allowed them fat profits to go out there and create news, which in of itself is a money-losing venture. But I think if you have these incumbents that have this business model that is now eroded because of the web, it's a natural tendency to want to defend that. And that could be through lobbyists. That could be through a lot of different means trying to control, the messaging. And to say, look, this is unfair to us. Our old way of doing things is no longer as lucrative. So the government has to help. And what I just find very funny is, anecdotally, like a few years ago, the crazy part of this conversation is I was chatting with a Bell exec who shall remain nameless, and they were saying that TSN, which has rights to sports, which is the so-called holy grail, but they don't own those sports. You know, they don't own hockey, they don't own NBA. They pay to carry it. They were like, we are concerned that if we put any of our content, which we pay for, on Facebook, we may validate Facebook. And this Bell exec was saying, that sounds crazy because Facebook, a global behemoth, does not need TSN or any single content creator to feel validated. The users have validated Facebook. Now, the crazy part is that is sports, right? Today, the conversation in Canada is around news. I don't want to sound like Chris Rock here, but the craziest part about news is that it's happening. These traditional media companies don't own it. They just have had a way of distributing this and covering it and monetizing it. And so what's happened is, if you fast forward to 2023, I'm not even sure that any traditional news organization is necessarily the best at covering any single kind of segment of news, whether it's international news that Canadians consume, whether it's provincial news or municipal sports or hyper-local news about where the best new restaurant is. There are a lot of voices out there, startups, but also individuals who cover that. So to me, when you come full circle, where a year ago, 2 years ago, a lot of us said, these are bad bills. They're not going to achieve what you think they're going to achieve. They're going to backfire. The Canadian government, you know, there's a saying where Hollywood thinks they rule the world, but Silicon Valley thinks they rule the universe. So you're going now up to Facebook and Google and these very powerful companies that don't need you. They don't need any single entity. And you're trying to dictate to them how to do business. Naturally, they're going to react to their best interest, and they'll argue the best interest of their users as well. And now they're blocking some content. But the government only has itself to blame. And as much as I respect Bell and Rogers and all these fine companies otherwise that do a lot of good as well as more questionable things, these companies only have themselves to blame. So when I'm driving around hearing these ads, I'm like, what did you think was going to happen? Where was the self-awareness? Where was the humility? You know, so today, I think these bills are actually are backfiring, and they're actually hurting the very same organizations that they sought to help.
With Ashkan Karbasfrooshan, the founder of WatchMojo. So Ash, listen, here's the thing. Like Facebook, they are doing the tough line. The links are gone from Facebook and Instagram. They're gone. But what I hear is, you know, Google is actually at the table. News has not disappeared. I use it every morning. Google News, I use it every morning to do the show. It's such a great, valuable product. And I hear that Google's like, oh, okay, we're malleable, and they're coming to the table. So why do you think there's a difference there? It seems like Facebook's doing the hard line and Google's more willing to play.
Well, previously when I would come on the show, and hopefully in the future if I'm not banned, I always refer to how Google, given its own DNA early on, its pedigree of indexing the web, they believe that, hey, we should also send traffic out. And then when they launched commercial products to so-called monetize traffic, they also said, hey, we're going to share some of the revenue with publishers. And on YouTube, they've been a pioneer in this democratization of production, distribution, and monetization of content, in that they share revenue with people like WatchMojo and millions of other Canadians and global creators. Facebook has always been very different. Facebook has been more of a so-called private walled garden, a bit like the old AOL, where you would have to insert a disk to kind of connect to the web, but it was a very private web. Facebook has never really had that same ethos, and Mark Zuckerberg is just a very different creature than the founders of Google, and Facebook has never had that same philosophy. So if you fast forward to today, it's not at all surprising that Facebook says, look, we don't really care about news. I don't think our users care about news, and frankly, news is very hard to monetize with advertisers, because if you're showing war, violence, blood, and racism, which is what a lot of news covers, advertisers are not going to rush into that burning house. It's a challenge, right? So it's just very normal to people who kind of work with Facebook and Google to say, well, this isn't surprising. This is exactly the Mark Zuckerberg playbook, to say, nope, we're going to take a hard line. We're not even going to be aware that there's a negotiation table to sit at, whereas Google is going to say, look, we'll play lip service. And, yesterday we were meeting our partners at Google YouTube, and I'm also critical of them when I need to be. I'm not just their cheerleader at all. But I think Google is generally more willing to sit at the table. They're still going to do what makes sense for Google. And I'm not so sure that they, in the end, are going to give the Canadian news organizations what they're looking for. But they're definitely going to approach it very differently. They're going to be a lot more diplomatic, at least on the outside.
So here's what I struggle with, Ash, because, by the way, there's valid points that there has been a democratization of information and content, the fact that anyone can start a channel, go on YouTube, and start to deliver content. I see the benefit to that. But here's what I struggle with. Covering the local city hall meetings, having a robust editorial process for investigative reporting in journalism requires resources and newsrooms, and I wonder how you protect that in a free-for-all system. So that's what I struggle with. And that's where I say, well, maybe there has to be some sort of mechanism.
So I agree with the first part. Like, this may surprise you. I studied finance, but in a different life, I maybe would have been a journalist myself. I published books. So, we hire people that come out of communications. We hire people that study broadcasting. We give them full-time jobs, benefits, paid vacation. We're not exploiting the fact that these fields are hard to recruit from at all. I believe in all of that. The challenge, however, and I think we're like, the average Joe, so to speak, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think we're the common man or common lady who is just working hard, 9 to 5. They have their own universe. They're struggling with bills. They have kids to kind of wash and feed and all that. They don't necessarily share the viewpoint that, only news organizations are going to give me a kind of unbiased, unvarnished, factual reporting. Look, I think radio is quite sheltered. I don't think radio is going to grow like wild, but radio is not going to go anywhere. You've seen the challenges of print, but even TV, which is like the filet mignon of production standards, when you turn on the news, and I'm not just talking about CNN, MSNBC, the kind of total extremes of the U.S. there, but when I used to turn on the 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock news, it didn't scream to me that this was necessarily what I as a citizen wanted to hear and watch. And I think that is where you're getting a little bit of the discrepancy, which is there's been historically this, we know better, we have the means, we have effectively a monopoly, so to speak. So ergo, we are going to decide not just what to cover, but how and the spin that we're going to put on it. And I think what the web does, and you've seen it with certain hyperlocal projects, is there is room for covering certain city bylaws and all that. But the reality is most people don't care about that either. You understand? So I think what the kind of break is... They don't,
let me just push back. They're never going to ask for it. But when but they need some sort of mechanism to find out that the city is going to tell them they have to remove their backyard pool. You know what I mean? They need a mechanism, and that's what I worry about. Ash,
I agree with you.
Yeah, okay. Ash, listen, we got to wrap it up here. I just want to ask you one quick last thing. Is it too early to pass judgment? Do we need to wait 3 months, 6 months before we can actually know for sure if this is a failure?
I think the answer is pretty clear, because if it was not a failure, then your parent company would not be running these PSA ads, effectively begging users now to do their bidding and making this doomsday scenario when most users probably are fine. So I think the answer is there. Whether or not, Google is going to come to the table and inadvertently force Facebook, sure, you could argue that remains to be seen. But I think any objective person looking at this would say these two bills were a flop. And I'm not blaming the Bell Medias and the Rogers for pushing for it. It's in their interest. But I think it once again shows that the people who run the government are clueless, and it's the blind leading the blind.
Ash, listen, we're going to leave it there. You're going to be invited back, because I've never ever had an editorial decision about a guest ever decided from high on up. It's never happened in 5 years, so I don't think it'll happen now. You'll be back, and I hope to catch up with you again real soon.
Thank you.
That's Ashkan Karbasfrooshan, the founder of WatchMojo.